Sarah Thompson's fingers trembled as she rang the doorbell of the imposing mansion. The chime echoed through the air, matching the nervous flutter in her chest. At 35, she'd cared for countless patients, but this job felt different. The door swung open, revealing a stern-faced butler who ushered her inside without a word. The foyer gleamed with marble and gold, a stark contrast to Sarah's modest attire. She clutched her bag tighter, following the butler's brisk steps through winding corridors. They stopped before a heavy oak door. "Mr. Blackwell is waiting," the butler announced, his tone clipped. "Mind your manners." Sarah nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped into the lion's den. Richard Blackwell sat in a high-backed leather chair, his steely gaze fixed on Sarah. Despite his 70 years, power radiated from him like heat from a furnace. His salt and pepper hair was immaculately styled, his suit tailored to perfection. "So, you're the new nurse," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "I hope you're more competent than the last one." Sarah straightened her spine. "I assure you, Mr. Blackwell, I'm highly qualified and—" "Spare me the speech," he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Just do your job and stay out of my way." And so began Sarah's employment as Richard Blackwell's private nurse. Days blurred into weeks, each one a test of her patience and professionalism. Richard seemed to take pleasure in belittling her, his sharp tongue finding fault in everything she did. "Can't you even make a decent cup of coffee?" he'd sneer, pushing away the mug she'd prepared. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell. I'll try again," Sarah would reply, swallowing her pride. But beneath her calm exterior, frustration simmered. She'd worked hard to earn her nursing degree, sacrificing nights and weekends to study while holding down 2 jobs. Now, all her skills and dedication were dismissed by a man who'd never known a day of hardship in his life. One morning, as Sarah was checking Richard's vitals, she noticed dark circles under his eyes. "Did you have trouble sleeping last night, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked gently. He glared at her. "What's it to you? Just do your job and stop prying." Sarah bit her lip, recognizing the signs of something deeper than mere irritability. Over the next few days, she observed Richard closely. He barely touched his meals, spent hours staring out the window, and snapped at everyone who came near him. Gathering her courage, Sarah approached him one evening as he sat in his study. "Mr. Blackwell, I hope you don't mind me saying, but I'm concerned about you. Have you considered talking to someone about how you're feeling?" Richard's face contorted with anger. "How dare you suggest I need help? You're nothing but a glorified maid. Know your place." His words stung, but Sarah stood her ground. "I'm a healthcare professional, Mr. Blackwell. It's my job to care for your well-being, both physical and mental." "Get out," he roared, face turning red. "Get out before I fire you on the spot." Sarah retreated, her heart heavy. She'd seen the flash of pain in Richard's eyes before fury took over. Something was eating away at him, and she was determined to help, whether he liked it or not. As weeks passed, Sarah tried different approaches to break through Richard's walls. She left inspirational quotes on his breakfast tray, played soft music during his physical therapy sessions, and even convinced the cook to prepare Richard's childhood favorite meals. But Richard remained as prickly as ever. "Do you think these pathetic attempts at kindness will make me like you?" he sneered one day. "I've met hundreds of gold diggers like you, trying to worm their way into my good graces." Sarah's patience finally snapped. "Mr. Blackwell, I don't want your money or your favor. I'm here because it's my job to care for you, and I take that responsibility seriously. Whether you believe it or not, there are people in this world who genuinely want to help others without expecting anything in return." For a moment, Richard looked taken aback. Then his face hardened again. Pretty words from someone who grew up with nothing. "You can't fool me, girl." Before Sarah could respond, the study door burst open. A young man in his 30s stormed in, his face a mirror image of Richard's scowl. "Dad, we need to talk about the company," he demanded. Richard's expression darkened further. "Michael, I told you I don't want to discuss this." Sarah quietly excused herself, but the raised voices followed her down the hall. She caught snippets of their argument, something about selling the family business and Richard's refusal to step down as CEO. The shouting grew louder, and Sarah hesitated. Should she intervene? Just as she decided to check on them, a loud thud echoed from the study. Sarah raced back, her heart pounding. She found Richard on the floor, his face ashen and contorted. Michael stood frozen, shock written all over his features. "Call 911, Sarah ordered as she knelt beside Richard. His breathing was labored, and the left side of his face drooped. She recognized the signs immediately. Richard was having a stroke. Sarah sprang into action, her training taking over. She turned Richard onto his side, loosened his collar, and began monitoring his vital signs. Every second counted. "Mr. Blackwell, can you hear me?" she asked clearly. "Squeeze my hand if you can understand me." A weak pressure on her fingers told her Richard was still conscious. Sarah continued talking to him, her voice calm and reassuring despite the chaos in her mind. The next few minutes felt like hours. Sarah performed a quick neurological assessment, noting Richard's symptoms to relay to the paramedics. She could hear Michael's panicked voice as he spoke to the 911 operator. Finally, the wail of sirens pierced the air. Paramedics rushed in, and Sarah quickly briefed them on Richard's condition and the steps she'd taken. As they loaded Richard into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Sarah. "You did good, miss. Your quick action might have just saved his life." Sarah watched the ambulance speed away, her scrubs stained with sweat and her hands shaking from the adrenaline rush. She turned to find Michael staring at her, his face a mix of gratitude and bewilderment. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here," he stammered. Sarah gave him a gentle smile. "It's what I'm trained for. We should get to the hospital. Your father will need you when he wakes up." As they rushed to the car, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, would this event change things? Or would Richard's harsh exterior remain intact, even in the face of his own mortality? "Do you think he'll be okay?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, we've done everything we can for now. The most important thing is that we got him help quickly. But Michael, there's something you should know about your father." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the road ahead as Michael navigated the car through the busy streets. "Your father, I've noticed signs of depression and isolation. Has he always been this way?" Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "He's always been difficult, but it's gotten worse since Mom died. I thought hiring a nurse might help, but he's been pushing everyone away," Sarah finished softly. Michael nodded, his jaw clenched. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts. At the hospital, they were directed to the intensive care unit. Richard lay still in the bed, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Blackwell's son?" he asked, looking at Michael. "Yes, that's me. How is he?" The doctor's expression was grave. "Your father has suffered a severe stroke. We've managed to stabilize him, but the next 48 hours will be critical. I understand he received immediate care at home." Sarah stepped forward. "I'm his private nurse. I recognized the signs and took action until the paramedics arrived." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Your quick response likely prevented further damage. Mr. Blackwell is fortunate you were there." As the doctor explained Richard's condition and treatment plan, Sarah watched Michael's face. The young man looked lost, so different from the angry figure who had stormed into Richard's study earlier. "Can I stay with him?" Michael asked once the doctor finished. "Of course. Talk to him. Let him know you're here. It can help." After the doctor left, Michael sank into the chair beside Richard's bed. He reached out hesitantly, then took his father's hand in his own. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Sarah's heart ached at the sight. She quietly excused herself, giving them privacy. In the waiting room, she called the Blackwell mansion to update the staff. As she hung up, exhaustion hit her like a wave. She slumped into a chair, the events of the day finally catching up with her. A gentle touch on her shoulder startled her awake. She blinked, disoriented, to find Michael standing over her. "You should go home and rest," he said. "I'll stay with him tonight." Sarah shook her head. "No, I should be here if he needs anything. It's my job." Michael's expression softened. "You've done more than enough. Please get some sleep. I'll call if anything changes." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. As she gathered her things, Michael spoke again. "Thank you for everything. I know my father hasn't been kind to you, but what you did today, thank you." Sarah managed a tired smile. "It's what I'm here for. Try to get some rest too, okay?" The next few days passed in a blur of hospital visits, medical consultations, and worried conversations. Richard remained unconscious, his condition stable but serious. Sarah split her time between the hospital and the Blackwell mansion, coordinating with the staff and preparing for Richard's eventual return home. On the 5th day, as Sarah was checking Richard's vitals, she noticed a flutter of movement. His eyelids twitched, then slowly opened. "Mr. Blackwell," she called softly. "Can you hear me?" Richard's eyes focused on her, confusion evident in his gaze. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak emerged. "Don't try to talk yet," Sarah soothed. "You're in the hospital. You had a stroke, but you're going to be okay." She pressed the call button for the nurse, then quickly texted Michael, who had finally been persuaded to go home and shower. The next few hours were a whirlwind of tests and examinations. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but it was clear that Richard had a long road ahead of him. The stroke had affected the left side of his body, impairing his speech and movement. When things finally calmed down, Sarah found herself alone with Richard. His usual scowl was absent, replaced by a look of vulnerability that tugged at her heart. What? Richard struggled to form the words. "What happened?" Sarah explained gently, watching his face for signs of understanding. When she finished, Richard closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his cheek. "Hey," Sarah said softly. "It's okay, you're still here. That's what matters." Richard opened his eyes, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Before he could respond, Michael burst into the room. "Dad!" he exclaimed, rushing to the bedside. "You're awake!" As father and son reunited, Sarah quietly slipped out of the room. She leaned against the wall outside, taking a moment to collect herself. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The next few weeks were grueling. Richard was released from the hospital but required round-the-clock care. His frustration at his limitations often boiled over into angry outbursts, testing Sarah's patience to its limits. "I can do it myself," Richard snapped one day as Sarah tried to help him with his physical therapy exercises. "Mr. Blackwell, I know this is difficult, but you need to follow the program if you want to regain your strength," Sarah replied, keeping her voice calm. Don't tell me what I need," he snarled, his face red with exertion and anger. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself that his anger stemmed from fear and helplessness. "Okay, why don't we take a break? I'll come back in a few minutes." As she turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped her. Wait." She looked back to see him slumped in his wheelchair, the fight gone out of him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words clearly costing him great effort. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. In all the months she'd worked for him, she'd never heard Richard Blackwell apologize to anyone. She moved back to his side, kneeling so they were at eye level. "It's okay. I know this isn't easy. But you're making progress, even if it doesn't feel like it. We're in this together, all right?" Richard nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. From that day on, something shifted in their relationship. Richard's sharp tongue was still present, but there was less venom in his words. He began to listen to Sarah's suggestions, even if he grumbled about them. One evening, as Sarah was helping Richard prepare for bed, he spoke up. Why are you so kind? After everything?" Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "Because everyone deserves kindness, Mr. Blackwell, especially when they're struggling." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Call me Richard." Sarah smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "Okay, Richard, let's get you settled for the night." As she turned out the light and closed the door, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. It was a small step, but a significant one. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for Richard Blackwell after all. "Michael, Sarah, can I talk to you for a moment? It's about Dad and, well, there's something you should know." Sarah, "Of course, Michael." What's on your mind? Michael led Sarah to the study, closing the door behind them. He paced for a moment, running a hand through his hair before turning to face her. I've been going through Dad's papers, he began, his voice low. There's something I found, something I think you should know. Sarah's brow furrowed. What is it, Michael? He took a deep breath. It's about you, Sarah, or rather about your family. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. My family? What do you mean? Michael pulled out a folder from the desk drawer. I found these old letters. They're from a woman named Elizabeth Thompson. Does that name mean anything to you? Sarah's eyes widened. That was my grandmother's name. But how? She wrote to my father years ago, Michael explained, his voice gentle. Sarah, it seems that your grandmother and my father, they had a relationship when they were young, before he met my mother. Sarah felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Are you saying? Michael nodded slowly. According to these letters, your mother was Richard Blackwell's daughter, which means, I'm his granddaughter, Sarah whispered, her mind reeling. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The strange feeling of familiarity she'd had when she first saw Richard, the inexplicable pull she felt to help him despite his cruelty. Does he know? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Michael shook his head. I don't think so. The letters were never opened. It looks like they were hidden away and forgotten. Sarah sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. I can't believe this. All this time. Michael knelt beside her, his face etched with concern. I'm sorry to spring this on you like this. I just thought you had a right to know. Sarah nodded numbly. Thank you for telling me. But what do we do now? Should we tell him? Michael sighed. I don't know. With his condition, it might be too much for him to handle right now. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the secret hanging between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. We need to tell him. He deserves to know the truth. And I need to know why he never acknowledged my mother. Michael nodded. You're right. We'll tell him together when the time is right. As Sarah left the study, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had come to this house as a stranger, endured months of harsh treatment, and now discovered she was caring for her own grandfather. The irony was almost too much to bear. Over the next few days, Sarah struggled to act normally around Richard. Every interaction was colored by her newfound knowledge. She found herself studying his face, looking for traces of herself or her mother in his features. Richard, still unaware of the revelation, continued to make slow but steady progress in his recovery. His speech was improving, and he was regaining some mobility on his left side. One afternoon, as Sarah was helping Richard with his exercises, he surprised her with a question. Tell me about your family, he said, his voice clearer than it had been in weeks. Sarah's hand froze on his arm. My family, Richard nodded. You never talk about them. Sarah took a deep breath, deciding how much to reveal. There's not much to tell. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my grandmother. I'm sorry, Richard said, and for once he sounded sincere. Sarah smiled sadly. It was a long time ago. My grandmother was wonderful. She's the reason I became a nurse. She always said that helping others was the highest calling. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a flash of recognition, quickly hidden. She sounds wise. Sarah's heart raced. Did he suspect? Did he remember Elizabeth Thompson? Before she could decide whether to press further, Richard winced in pain. Are you okay? Sarah asked, immediately shifting into nurse mode. Richard nodded, but his face was pale. Just tired. Let's call it a day then, Sarah said, helping him back to his chair. As she tucked a blanket around his legs, she made a decision. It was time for the truth to come out. That evening, Sarah sought out Michael. We need to tell him, she said without preamble. Tomorrow? Michael looked surprised but nodded. Okay, are you sure you're ready? Sarah took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Sarah went through her usual routine, her stomach in knots. As she brought Richard his breakfast, she steeled herself for what was to come. Richard, she said, using his first name as he'd requested. "There's something Michael and I need to talk to you about. When you're feeling up to it, of course." Richard looked at her curiously. "Is something wrong?" Sarah shook her head. "No, nothing's wrong. It's just important." Richard studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "After breakfast." Sarah texted Michael, and soon all three of them were gathered in Richard's room. Michael held the folder of letters, his knuckles white with tension. "Dad," he began, "we found some old letters while going through your papers. Letters from a woman named Elizabeth Thompson." Richard's face drained of color. For a moment, Sarah feared he might have another stroke. But he simply closed his eyes, his expression a mix of pain and resignation. "You know that name?" Michael pressed gently. Richard nodded slowly. "From long ago." Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Richard, Elizabeth Thompson was my grandmother." Richard's eyes snapped open, locking onto Sarah's face. For a long moment, he just stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "It can't be," he whispered. Michael handed him the letters. With shaking hands, Richard opened the first one, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. As he read, tears began to roll down his cheeks. Sarah and Michael exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to comfort him or give him space. Finally, Richard looked up, his eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I never read them." Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. "It's okay. We know now. That's what matters." Richard squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Can you forgive me?" Sarah felt tears welling in her own eyes. "There's nothing to forgive. You didn't know." Richard shook his head. "No, for everything. The way I treated you." Sarah smiled through her tears. Already forgiven. As the three of them sat together, the truth settling around them like a new reality, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. They had a long way to go, a lifetime of missed connections to make up for. But they had taken the first step. Richard cleared his throat. "Tell me about your mother, my daughter." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. Her name was Grace. Michael. "Dad, Sarah, I think this is the beginning of something new for all of us. But there's still so much to figure out. How do you want to move forward?" Richard. "One day at a time, together." Sarah. "I couldn't agree more, and I think I know just where we can start." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes moving between Richard and Michael. "I think we should start by getting to know each other properly, not as employer and employee or as strangers, but as family." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes still rimmed with tears. "I'd like that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Me too," Michael added, a small smile on his face. "But Sarah, are you sure? After everything?" Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "The past is the past. What matters now is what we do going forward." She turned to Richard. "I have so many questions about my mother, about your relationship with my grandmother. But I also want to know about you, Richard. The real you, not just the tough businessman everyone sees." Richard's face softened, a look of vulnerability crossing his features. "I'm not sure I know who that is anymore," he admitted quietly. "Then we'll figure it out together," Sarah said firmly. "Starting now." Over the next few weeks, a new routine developed in the Blackwell mansion. Sarah continued to care for Richard, but their interactions took on a different tone. During physical therapy sessions, they would share stories. Sarah about her childhood and nursing school, Richard about his early days building his business empire. One afternoon, as Sarah helped Richard with his arm exercises, he spoke up hesitantly. "Your mother, Grace, she had your eyes." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. "You remember her?" Richard nodded, his gaze distant. "I only saw her once from afar. She was about 5. Elizabeth, your grandmother. She brought her to the park near my office. I watched them for hours, too afraid to approach." "Why didn't you?" Sarah asked softly. Richard's face contorted with old pain. I was a coward. I had just married Michael's mother, built my company. I was afraid of losing everything. He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. We can't change the past, Richard, but we're here now. As Richard's physical health improved, so did his emotional state. The sharp edges of his personality softened, revealing a man capable of kindness and even humor. Michael, too, seemed to blossom in this new family dynamic, the old tensions with his father easing day by day. One evening, as they all sat in the garden enjoying the sunset, Richard cleared his throat. I've been thinking, he began, his speech clearer now after weeks of therapy, about the future, about legacy. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. What do you mean, Dad? Michael asked. Richard took a deep breath. I want to make amends, not just to our family but to the world. I've spent my life accumulating wealth, often at the expense of others. It's time I did something meaningful with it. What are you suggesting? Sarah asked, leaning forward with interest. I want to donate a significant portion of my fortune, Richard said, his voice gaining strength, to improve healthcare for underprivileged communities, to support nurses and caregivers who do the work you do, Sarah. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Richard, that's incredible. Michael nodded in agreement. It's a wonderful idea, Dad. But what about the company? Richard turned to his son. That's where you come in, Michael. I want you to take over as CEO, but with a new mission. We'll shift our focus to sustainable energy, invest in technologies that help people and the planet. Michael's face lit up. Really? You're ready to step down? Richard chuckled. More than ready. It's time for new blood, new ideas, and I trust you to lead the company in the right direction. As they discussed the details of Richard's plan, Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest. This was more than she could have ever hoped for when she first stepped into this mansion. Not only had she found her family, but she was witnessing a profound transformation in the man she now knew as her grandfather. Over the next few months, the Blackwell family worked tirelessly to bring Richard's vision to life. Sarah took charge of the healthcare initiative, using her experience as a nurse to identify the areas of greatest need. Michael dove into restructuring the company, excited about the new direction. Richard, for his part, threw himself into physical therapy with renewed vigor. His determination to regain his independence was fueled by his desire to be actively involved in their new projects. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah pushed Richard's wheelchair through the local park, the very same park where he had once watched her mother from afar, he suddenly gripped the armrests. Richard, Sarah asked, concerned, are you okay? To her amazement, Richard began to push himself up from the chair. His legs shook with the effort, but slowly, steadily, he rose to his feet. Richard, Sarah gasped, moving to support him. You're standing! Richard's face was a mix of concentration and triumph. I've been practicing, he said, taking a shaky step forward. Wanted to surprise you. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she watched her grandfather take his first independent steps since the stroke. It was a powerful symbol of how far they had all come. As they made their way slowly around the park, Richard leaning on Sarah for support, he spoke softly. I never thought I'd have this, a second chance, a family. Sarah smiled, blinking back tears. Life has a funny way of giving us what we need, even if it's not what we expected. Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the playground where children laughed and played. I wasted so many years, Sarah, so much time lost. But think of all we've gained, Sarah reminded him gently, and all the good we're going to do. As they completed their circuit of the park, Richard's steps grew more confident. By the time they reached the wheelchair, he was walking with only minimal support from Sarah. I think, Richard said, a mischievous glint in his eye, that we can leave this chair here for someone who really needs it. Sarah laughed, shaking her head in amazement. Are you sure? Richard nodded firmly. It's time to move forward, on my own 2 feet. As they walked slowly back towards the mansion, Sarah marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. From strangers to family, from resentment to love, they had traversed a landscape of emotions and experiences she never could have imagined. "Sarah," Richard said as they approached the house, "I want you to know, I'm proud of you. And I know your mother would be too." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion. "Thank you, Richard. That means more than you know." As they entered the house, Michael looked up from his laptop, his jaw dropping at the sight of his father walking unaided. "Dad, this is incredible." Richard smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his entire face. "It feels good to be back on my feet. Now, let's talk about our next steps. We have a lot of work to do." Sarah watched as father and son bent over the computer, discussing their plans with enthusiasm. She felt a sense of purpose and belonging she had never known before. This was her family, imperfect and complicated, but bound together by love and a shared vision for the future. As she moved to join them, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a mirror. For a moment, she saw not just herself, but echoes of her mother, her grandmother, and even Richard. She was a bridge between past and future, a healer not just of bodies, but of a family's broken history. With a smile, she stepped forward into her new life, ready for whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. "Michael." "Sarah, Dad, I've been thinking, with all these changes, maybe it's time we made it official. How would you feel about changing the company name to Blackwell and Thompson?" Richard, "I think that's a wonderful idea, son." "Sarah, what do you say?" "Sarah, I don't know what to say. Are you both sure?" Sarah's eyes darted between Richard and Michael, her heart racing at the unexpected proposal. "Are you really sure about this?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We've never been more sure of anything, Sarah. Your family. It's time the world knew it too." Michael nodded in agreement. "You've brought us together in ways we never thought possible. This company's future is as much yours as it is ours." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the weight of their words sank in. She had come to this house as a nurse, an outsider looking in on a world of wealth and power. Now, she was being offered a place at the very heart of it all. I don't know anything about running a company," she admitted, a hint of fear creeping into her voice. Richard chuckled softly. "Neither did I when I started. But you have something far more valuable than business knowledge, Sarah. You have compassion, integrity, and a vision for how we can make a real difference in people's lives." Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. Your perspective is exactly what this company needs as we move in this new direction." Sarah took a deep breath, looking from Richard to Michael and back again. She saw the sincerity in their eyes, the hope and expectation. Slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Okay," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Okay, let's do it. Blackwell and Thompson it is." The room erupted in cheers and laughter. Richard pulled Sarah into a warm embrace, while Michael pumped his fist in the air triumphantly. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration of new beginnings and healed wounds. As the excitement settled, they began to discuss the practicalities of the name change and what it would mean for the company's future. Sarah listened intently, asking questions and offering insights from her healthcare background. With each passing minute, she felt more confident in her new role. Over the next few weeks, news of the company's rebranding and shift in focus spread like wildfire through the business world. Journalists clamored for interviews, eager to understand the story behind the mysterious Thompson who had suddenly appeared in the Blackwell family tree. Sarah found herself thrust into a world she had never imagined. Board meetings, press conferences, charity galas. It was overwhelming at times, but she faced each new challenge with the same determination and compassion that had defined her nursing career. One evening, as Sarah pored over financial reports in the study, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Richard watching her from the doorway, a proud smile on his face. "You're a natural at this," he said, walking into the room with only the slightest hint of a limp. "I knew you would be." Sarah laughed softly. "I'm not sure about that. Half the time I feel like I'm swimming in the deep end without a life jacket." Richard sat down beside her, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "That feeling never really goes away, you know. The secret is to keep swimming anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day. "I've been thinking," Richard said finally, his tone turning serious. "About your mother. About Grace." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Despite their growing closeness, they had rarely spoken about her mother since the initial revelation. "What about her?" Sarah asked softly. Richard took a deep breath. "I want to honor her memory, to acknowledge her as my daughter, even if it's far too late." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was thinking we could establish a scholarship fund in her name for aspiring nurses from underprivileged backgrounds." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "Richard, that's beautiful. She would have loved that." "There's more," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to find her grave, to pay my respects properly. Will you come with me?" Sarah reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Of course I will. We'll go together." The next day, Sarah and Richard made the journey to the small cemetery where Grace Thompson was buried. As they stood before the simple headstone, Sarah felt a whirlwind of emotions: grief for the mother she had lost so young, gratitude for the grandmother who had raised her, and a bittersweet joy at sharing this moment with the grandfather she had only recently found. Richard knelt slowly, placing a bouquet of lilies on the grave. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. But I promise, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to your daughter." As they left the cemetery, both wiping away tears, Sarah felt a sense of closure. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of promise. Back at the mansion, they threw themselves into work with renewed vigor. The Grace Thompson Nursing Scholarship was established, offering hope and opportunity to dozens of young people who dreamed of following in Sarah's footsteps. Blackwell and Thompson quickly gained a reputation as a force for good in the business world. Their sustainable energy initiatives were praised by environmental groups, while their healthcare programs brought relief to communities in need. 1 year after Sarah's life had been turned upside down by Richard's stroke, the family gathered in the garden to celebrate. Michael had invited some of their key employees and partners, wanting to share their success with those who had helped make it possible. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Richard clinked his glass for attention. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to the man who had once been known as a ruthless tycoon, but now stood before them, transformed. "A year ago," Richard began, his voice strong and clear, "I thought my life was over. I had wealth, power, but I was alone, empty." He paused, his eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. "And then this remarkable young woman came into my life. She not only saved me physically, but she helped me find my soul again." Sarah felt a blush creep up her cheeks as people turned to look at her. Richard continued, "Sarah showed me that it's never too late to change, to make amends, to find love and purpose. She, along with my son Michael, have helped me build something I'm truly proud of, a company that puts people first, that strives to make the world a better place." He raised his glass high, to family, to second chances, and to the bright future of Blackwell and Thompson. The crowd cheered, glasses clinking all around. As Sarah sipped her champagne, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find an elderly woman smiling at her. "I just wanted to thank you, dear," the woman said, her eyes shining. "My grandson just got accepted into nursing school thanks to your scholarship program. You're changing lives, you know." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means everything to me." As the party continued around her, Sarah took a moment to look around. She saw Richard deep in conversation with a group of young engineers, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. Michael was laughing with some of their employees, his arm around his fiancée, whom he had met through one of their charitable initiatives. And here she was, Sarah Thompson, once a struggling nurse and now a beacon of hope for so many. Life had taken her on an unexpected journey, full of twists and turns, but she wouldn't change a moment of it. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Sarah raised her glass in a silent toast. To her mother, her grandmother, to the family she had found, and to all the lives they would touch in the years to come. The future was bright indeed. Richard. Sarah, there's something else I've been meaning to ask you. It's about the future of Blackwell and Thompson. Sarah. What is it, Richard? Is everything all right? Richard. More than all right. I was wondering if you'd consider... Richard took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Sarah's with a mixture of hope and nervousness. I was wondering if you'd consider taking over as CEO of Blackwell and Thompson. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Me? But what about Michael? I thought he was next in line. Richard smiled softly. Michael and I have discussed this at length. He's doing incredible work with our sustainable energy division, and he feels that's where his true passion lies. But the company as a whole, we both agree it needs someone with your vision and heart at the helm. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. But Richard, I don't have the business experience. Surely there are more qualified candidates. Experience can be gained, Richard said firmly. But your innate understanding of what this company should stand for, your commitment to making a real difference in people's lives, that's not something that can be taught. It's who you are, Sarah. Michael, who had been quietly listening nearby, stepped forward. He's right, Sarah. I've seen how you've transformed not just the company, but all of us. You're the leader we need. Sarah felt overwhelmed. She looked around at the party guests, at the life she had built over the past year. Could she really take on such a massive responsibility? As if reading her thoughts, Richard gently took her hand. You don't have to decide right now. Take some time to think about it. But know this, we believe in you completely. Sarah nodded, grateful for the chance to process this monumental offer. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, she found herself wandering to a quiet corner of the garden. She sat on a bench, gazing up at the stars, her mind swirling with possibilities and doubts. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Mind if I join you? Sarah looked up to see Lisa, Michael's fiancée, standing nearby. She nodded, patting the space beside her. Lisa sat down, her eyes kind and understanding. Richard told me about the offer. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? Sarah chuckled softly. That's an understatement. I never imagined anything like this when I first took this job. Life has a funny way of surprising us, Lisa mused. But Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you'd be amazing at it. I've seen how the employees look up to you, how you always put people first. That's rare in the corporate world. Sarah sighed, voicing her deepest fear. But what if I fail? What if I let everyone down? Lisa placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. That's not failure talking. That's responsibility. The fact that you're worried about letting people down shows exactly why you're the right person for this job. As they talked, Sarah felt her fears begin to subside, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She thought about all the lives they could touch, all the positive changes they could make in the world. By the time she went to bed that night, Sarah had made her decision. The next morning, she found Richard and Michael in the study, poring over some documents. They looked up as she entered, hope evident in their eyes. Sarah took a deep breath. I've thought about your offer, and I accept. I'd be honored to lead Blackwell and Thompson. The room erupted in joy. Richard pulled her into a tight hug, tears glistening in his eyes. You're going to do great things, Sarah, I just know it. Michael beamed, clapping her on the back. Welcome to the hot seat, sis. We've got your back, always. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah immersed herself in learning every aspect of the business, from finance to operations to marketing. She spent countless hours with Richard, soaking up his decades of experience. Michael was always there to offer support and guidance, and together, they formed a formidable team. On the day of the official announcement, Sarah stood before a room full of reporters, her family by her side. As flashbulbs popped and questions flew, she felt a calm certainty settle over her. Blackwell and Thompson is more than just a company, she began, her voice strong and clear. It's a promise to use our resources and influence to make the world a better place. Under my leadership, we will continue to innovate in sustainable energy, expand our healthcare initiatives, and always put people first. The press conference was a resounding success. Sarah's sincerity and passion shone through, capturing the imagination of the public and the respect of the business world. As weeks turned into months and months into years, Blackwell and Thompson flourished under Sarah's leadership. The company expanded its charitable works, became a leader in green technology, and set new standards for corporate responsibility. But for Sarah, the most rewarding moments were often the smallest ones, like the day she visited a rural clinic funded by their healthcare initiative and saw firsthand the lives they were saving, or the afternoon she spent mentoring a group of nursing students, sharing her journey and inspiring the next generation of caregivers. 5 years after taking the reins of Blackwell and Thompson, Sarah stood at the podium of a prestigious business awards ceremony. As she accepted the CEO of the Year award, she looked out at the audience and saw her family, Richard, Michael, Lisa, and their 2 young children, beaming with pride. "This award doesn't belong to me," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "It belongs to every employee of Blackwell and Thompson who believes in our mission. It belongs to every life we've touched, every community we've helped. And it belongs to my family, who taught me that it's never too late for second chances, for healing, for love." Later that night, as the family celebrated at home, Richard pulled Sarah aside. His hair was now completely white, but his eyes still sparkled with the same energy she'd come to know and love. "I have something for you," he said, pressing a small box into her hand. Sarah opened it to find a simple silver locket. Inside was a photo of her mother on one side, and on the other, a picture of Sarah, Richard, and Michael taken at her first company picnic as CEO. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Richard said softly. "I know I am." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She clasped the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of her past and her present resting over her heart. As she looked around at her family, the one she'd found in the most unexpected of places, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. From a struggling nurse to the CEO of a major corporation, her journey had been anything but ordinary. But through it all, she had remained true to herself and her values. The little girl who once dreamed of helping people while playing nurse with her dolls had grown into a woman who was changing the world, one decision at a time. And as she stood there, surrounded by love and purpose, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There were still so many lives to touch, so much good to be done. With her family by her side and the lessons of the past guiding her way, Sarah Thompson was ready to face whatever the future might bring. The journey, she realized, was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning.